Margaret Winters sat in her modest living room, surrounded by the artifacts of a life well lived: sepia-toned wedding photos of her and Frank, a vase filled with pressed daisies from their honeymoon, and the faint scent of lavender lingering from a diffuser. Frank had passed away 5 years ago, but his presence was everywhere. Margaret's world had shrunk since his death. Quiet days of tending her small garden, chatting with her neighbor, and watching reruns of old sitcoms. But tonight, for the first time in years, her heart raced with something other than grief. She was sitting at her computer, hands trembling as she typed a response to Edward Grayson, a charming man who had sent her a message on an online community for widows. His words were kind, understanding, and disarmingly specific. "Margaret," he had written, "I noticed you mentioned daisies were Frank's favorite flower. My late wife loved them too. Funny how something so simple can hold so much meaning, isn't it?" Margaret felt her chest tighten. How could he know? Was it just a coincidence? Or was it fate? She had been skeptical of online communities, but Edward's messages had a warmth and authenticity she hadn't expected. Over the weeks, their conversations deepened. They exchanged long messages filled with stories about their late spouses, their shared love of classic literature, and their dreams of travel that had never come to pass. One evening, Edward sent her a photo of himself, a silver-haired man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Margaret hesitated before sending her own photo in return, feeling self-conscious about her age, but Edward's immediate reply eased her worries. "Margaret, you have the most honest eyes I've ever seen. I can tell Frank must have been a very lucky man." Margaret smiled at her screen, her heart swelling in a way she hadn't thought possible anymore. Weeks turned into months. Margaret began to blossom in ways that startled even her. Claire, her adult daughter, noticed the change. "Mom, you're humming," Claire teased during a visit, raising an eyebrow as Margaret prepared tea. "What's gotten into you?" "Oh, it's nothing," Margaret replied, trying to suppress a smile. But Claire wasn't convinced. She hadn't seen her mother this light on her feet in years. Later that evening, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Edward. "I was thinking of you today, Margaret. What if we went to Paris together someday? You and me, the Eiffel Tower, and a toast to the ones we loved and lost." Margaret's hand flew to her chest. Paris. She had always wanted to go with Frank, but life had gotten in the way. Now, here was Edward, offering her a dream she thought she'd buried long ago. The conversations grew more intimate. Edward started calling her every evening, his deep voice soothing her through the loneliness of the night. One evening, as she sat in her small garden, she shared something she hadn't told anyone else. "Frank always wanted me to keep the garden," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Even when he got sick, he'd sit here, saying it reminded him of simpler times. I almost stopped after he passed, but I couldn't let it go." "You're tending to more than flowers, Margaret," Edward said gently. "You're tending to his memory. That's a beautiful thing." But alongside the bloom of this unexpected connection, small cracks began to show. Edward mentioned he was working on a venture to restore a historic building in his town. He shared vivid details about the project, even sending Margaret pictures of a grand but deteriorating estate. "It's all for people like us, Margaret," he said. "A place for those who've loved and lost to come together. I call it the Haven." Margaret was moved by the idea, but something about his tone struck a chord of unease. It felt rehearsed, calculated. Then came the first request. "It's embarrassing to admit," Edward began, his voice heavy with hesitation, "but some unexpected legal fees are threatening to stall the project. I hate to even ask, but I know how much you understand this dream of mine. Would you be willing to loan me something? Just a little, until the funding comes through." Margaret hesitated, her heart warring with her head. Could she truly trust this man, who had brought color back into her gray world? But as she looked at the blooming daisies in her garden, a fragile but persistent symbol of hope, she whispered into the phone, "Of course, Edward, I'd be happy to help." Claire grew suspicious. Margaret mentioned Edward sparingly, but with an unmistakable glow. One afternoon, Claire confronted her. "Mom, you barely knew how to turn on a computer 6 months ago, and now you're chatting with some man online? You don't even know if he's real." Margaret bristled. "Edward is kind and thoughtful. He's been through so much, just like I have. Don't you dare belittle that." "But Mom—" "No," Margaret cut her off. "I deserve a little happiness, Claire, after everything, don't I?" By the time Edward asked for a second loan, Margaret didn't hesitate. It wasn't just the money, it was the way he spoke to her, the way he made her feel seen. For the first time since Frank's death, she felt like more than just a grieving widow. She felt alive. But in the shadows of her joy, unseen threads were unraveling. The stakes were about to rise, and the consequences would be devastating. Margaret's life began to revolve around her late-night chats with Edward. Each message carried an air of intimacy she hadn't felt in decades. His words felt like poetry, filling a void in her heart that had been empty since Frank's passing. He talked of sunsets on the Amalfi Coast, of dreams they could share, and of a love that felt destined. The more Edward revealed about himself, his tragic past, his dreams of starting over, the deeper Margaret fell. When Edward shared his plans to buy a small vineyard in Italy, Margaret's imagination soared. She pictured herself there with him, in a quiet countryside, where the pain of Frank's absence could finally fade. But then came Edward's confession. His funds were tied up in legal troubles, and he was short on cash to secure the deal. It wasn't a direct ask for help, but Margaret offered anyway, wanting to prove her love and faith in their future. At first, it was a small transfer, just enough to cover a supposed legal fee. Then came more urgent requests, unexpected taxes, a medical emergency, and delays in the sale of his assets. Edward's tone grew more desperate, and Margaret's financial help became the lifeline he claimed he needed. Meanwhile, Claire was growing uneasy. She noticed the subtle changes in her mother, how her focus drifted during their calls, her hesitation when asked about her savings, and the increasingly cryptic mentions of a new friend. One afternoon, while helping Margaret with her garden, Claire saw the name Edward flash across her mother's phone screen. The message preview read, "I can't wait for us to be together, my darling." Margaret quickly tucked her phone away, but the moment stuck with Claire. That evening, Claire searched Edward's name online, hoping to find something, anything that could explain why her mother was so secretive. What she found instead was nothing. No social media, no business records, no evidence of the man her mother was so enamored with. Determined to dig deeper, Claire began subtly questioning her mother about Edward. Margaret grew defensive, brushing off Claire's concerns as jealousy or overprotectiveness. "You don't understand, Claire," she said one night, her voice wavering. "I've been so lonely since your father. Edward makes me feel alive again." The emotional weight of Margaret's words made Claire hesitate. Her mother had endured so much since Frank's passing. Was Claire's suspicion rooted in love or control? Torn between wanting to protect Margaret and not wanting to hurt her, Claire decided to tread carefully. Margaret's relationship with Edward continued to grow, and so did his requests. He needed her help to finalize the vineyard purchase, to fly them both out to Italy, and even to cover a lawsuit from a disgruntled former partner. Each request was accompanied by tender words of love and promises of a life together. But cracks in Edward's story began to show. His explanations for his financial troubles grew convoluted, and his tone shifted when Margaret hesitated to send money. Once, she noticed he misremembered details about their earlier conversations. Details that seemed too important to forget. These small discrepancies nagged at her, but she pushed the doubts aside, afraid of what they might mean. After all, Edward had become her everything. Claire's unease reached a breaking point when she overheard Margaret speaking on the phone. From the hallway, Claire heard her mother's trembling voice saying, "Edward, I've sent everything I have. I don't know what else I can do." That night, while Margaret slept, Claire went through her mother's emails and found the transfers, thousands of dollars wired to an untraceable account. She also found something more chilling. Messages where Edward subtly manipulated Margaret's memories of Frank, claiming, "He would want you to be happy, Margaret. He would want you to trust me." Claire felt a mix of rage and heartbreak. Her mother's vulnerability was being exploited in the cruelest way. The Edward she had never trusted was clearly not who he claimed to be. She decided to confront her mother, even if it risked destroying their relationship. The tension built as Claire sat Margaret down, laptop in hand, ready to reveal her findings. Margaret's face turned pale as Claire showed her the evidence. Edward's contradictions, his lack of an online presence, and the patterns of his manipulative behavior. But instead of relief or gratitude, Margaret erupted in anger. "You've never trusted me to make my own decisions. Edward loves me. You don't understand what it's like to feel alone." Claire, stung by her mother's words, realized how deeply Edward had entrenched himself in Margaret's life. But even more heartbreaking was the realization that Margaret's need for love and connection was greater than her ability to see the truth. As Margaret stormed out, Claire was left in the dark, wondering if her mother would ever believe her, or if she'd lose her forever to a lie. Margaret refused to speak to Claire for days after the confrontation. She clung to Edward's words like a lifeline, believing in his promises despite the growing cracks in his story. Her garden, once a vibrant symbol of her healing, began to wilt, neglected as Margaret poured all her energy into salvaging her fragile dream. Edward's messages became increasingly urgent. He claimed he was close to resolving everything, a single transfer away from buying their vineyard and finally being together. "After this, Margaret, I'll never ask you for anything again. I swear. We'll have everything we've ever dreamed of." Margaret hesitated, her hands trembling as she stared at her bank account. The funds were nearly gone. Frank's pension, their savings, everything she'd worked her entire life for, reduced to numbers on a screen. But Edward's words echoed in her mind. "Frank would want you to be happy." The thought of Frank, his steady voice, his unwavering love, filled her with bittersweet longing. She imagined him standing beside her, urging her to move forward, to take one last chance on happiness. Tears blurred her vision as she clicked send. The screen confirmed the transfer. Margaret sat back, her heart heavy with hope and fear. Edward promised he'd call immediately after the transaction went through. Hours passed, and the phone didn't ring. Margaret checked her messages, but there was nothing. Anxiety clawed at her chest. She sent him a text. "Edward, did you get the funds? Is everything okay?" No reply. By midnight, Margaret's worry had turned to dread. She stayed awake, refreshing her inbox and checking her phone every few minutes. The silence was deafening. The next morning, Claire arrived unannounced. Margaret, frazzled and hollow-eyed, tried to brush her off, but Claire pushed her way inside. She found the house in disarray, unopened mail scattered on the kitchen counter, the garden visible through the window, overgrown and neglected. "Mom," Claire said, her voice trembling, "have you heard from him?" Margaret's lips quivered as she shook her head. She looked so small, so frail, that Claire's anger softened into pity. "I just need more time," Margaret whispered. "He'll call. I know he will." Claire took a deep breath, pulling out her phone. "Mom, I've been doing more research. I think we need to report this." Margaret recoiled as if struck. "Report what? That I trusted someone? That I believed in love again? You don't understand, Claire. He's all I have." "No, Mom," Claire said gently but firmly. "He's taken everything you have." Together, they went through Margaret's emails and messages. The painful truth unraveled before their eyes. Edward's photos were stolen from a stock image site. His supposed legal documents were amateurish forgeries. The account Margaret had been wiring money to was registered in an entirely different name. Piece by piece, the dream Edward had built crumbled into dust. Margaret collapsed into a chair, staring blankly at the screen. "How could I be so stupid?" she whispered. "Frank trusted me with everything, and I let him down. I let you down." Claire knelt beside her, her own tears falling. "You didn't let anyone down, Mom. You wanted to believe in something good. That's not stupid. That's human." But Margaret wasn't comforted. The weight of what she'd lost pressed down on her like a physical force. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice hollow. "I have nothing left." They reported Edward to the authorities, but the process was slow and riddled with complications. Investigators admitted that recovering the stolen funds was unlikely. Scammers like Edward operated with precision, disappearing into the shadows the moment their schemes were exposed. Weeks passed. Margaret withdrew from the world, her shame and grief isolating her, even from Claire. She stopped answering the phone, stopped tending the garden. Her house grew quiet, lifeless. One day, Claire visited unannounced again, worried about her mother's silence. She found Margaret sitting alone in the living room, holding an old photograph of Frank. "I thought I was strong," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "But I'm not. I'm just a foolish old woman." Claire hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You're not foolish, Mom. You're kind and loving, and that's not something to be ashamed of. Please, let me help you." But Margaret couldn't meet her daughter's eyes. "I can't," she said softly. "I've lost too much." The days after Margaret's discovery of Edward's deceit were a blur of denial and crushing reality. Margaret retreated into herself, oscillating between disbelief and self-loathing. Claire stayed close, trying to help, but her mother's devastation was a wall she couldn't breach. Margaret's home, once so warm and inviting, felt hollow. Bills piled up on the counter, but there was no money left to pay them. Claire tried to console her, suggesting ways they could rebuild, but Margaret barely listened. "How do you rebuild from nothing?" she whispered one evening, staring at the empty garden. Claire decided to take action herself. She contacted the authorities, local support groups, and even news outlets, hoping to raise awareness about scams targeting vulnerable people. Despite her efforts, Margaret didn't feel vindicated. Every story Claire shared felt like a public display of her shame. Margaret began selling off small possessions to cover her mounting debts. The wedding band she'd once cherished sat in a pawn shop window. The old clock Frank had repaired every year was boxed up and sold online. Each loss felt like another nail in the coffin of her former life. Edward's messages, once a source of hope, became a source of haunting regret. She'd scroll through their conversations at night, rereading his promises of love and security. She began to question everything. Was any of it real? Could someone fake such affection so convincingly? Each unanswered question deepened her despair. One day, Claire arrived with good news. "Mom, the local news station wants to do a segment on you," she said cautiously. "It could help expose what happened and prevent this from happening to others." But Margaret refused. "I'm not going to be paraded around as some fool," she snapped. "I don't want pity. I just want my life back." Claire's frustration boiled over. "This isn't just about you, Mom. Other people could be saved if they hear your story. Don't you want something good to come out of this?" Margaret's voice broke as she replied, "What good could possibly come from me losing everything, Claire? Everything I had, everything I was." She didn't finish the sentence, her voice dissolving into sobs. As Margaret's financial situation worsened, she began to face calls from debt collectors. Claire tried to take over, negotiating payment plans and advocating for leniency, but the stress weighed heavily on both of them. Claire's own life suffered as she spent more time trying to hold her mother together. Her job performance faltered, and her relationship strained under the pressure. Margaret stopped leaving the house entirely. The world outside felt judgmental, a place where every glance seemed to confirm her fears, that she was nothing more than a foolish old woman. Even the garden she'd once loved became a symbol of her failures, each wilted flower a reminder of what she'd lost. One evening, Claire found Margaret sitting by the window, gazing at the overgrown yard. "Do you remember when Frank built that birdhouse?" Margaret asked softly. "He spent hours on it, sanding every piece, painting it just right. He said it was for me, but I think he really wanted to see the birds." Claire nodded, fighting back tears. "He did it because he loved you, Mom." Margaret turned to her daughter, her eyes hollow. "And I let him down. I let you both down." Margaret's despair reached its peak one night when Claire returned to find her mother standing in the garden, clutching a small suitcase. "I'm leaving, Claire," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't stay here anymore. Every corner of this house is a reminder of what I lost." Claire panicked. "Mom, where will you go? You don't have to do this. We can work through this together." But Margaret shook her head. "You've done enough. Too much. You shouldn't have to carry my mistakes. I need to figure things out on my own." Claire begged her to stay, but Margaret left that night, disappearing into the cold. Margaret's absence was like a shadow over Claire's life. Days turned into weeks with no word from her mother. Claire filed missing person reports, posted flyers, and reached out to shelters, but there was no sign of her. One day, Claire received a letter in the mail. It was from Margaret, postmarked from a nearby town. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Claire, I'm sorry for everything. You were right. I shouldn't have trusted Edward, but more than that, I shouldn't have let it destroy me. I hope one day you can forgive me for leaving. I love you. Please take care of the garden." The letter gave Claire a flicker of hope, but it was short-lived. Margaret's final act was discovered days later, a motel room, a quiet farewell. She left behind her wedding ring, a small photograph of Frank, and a single blooming flower from the garden she'd finally let go of. The weeks after Margaret's death were a blur for Claire. The letter her mother had sent became a fixture on her bedside table, its words haunting her every night. She replayed their last conversations in her head, wishing she'd said more, done more. But guilt was a cruel companion, and it whispered constantly that she had failed. The garden Margaret had loved so much was now a withering reminder of what had been lost. The flowers were overgrown, the weeds choking out what little color remained. Claire couldn't bear to touch it, as though leaving it untouched somehow preserved her mother's memory. One crisp morning, Claire stood in the garden, clutching the fragile bloom Margaret had left behind. The weight of her grief pressed against her chest. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Take care of the garden." But it wasn't just the garden Margaret meant. Claire realized it was a plea to carry forward her mother's love, her resilience, and perhaps even her mistakes, as painful as they were. The garden was Margaret's legacy, a place where beauty had once flourished despite life's storms. Claire knelt in the dirt and began pulling the weeds. The act was small, almost insignificant, but with each handful, she felt as though she was clawing through her own pain. Neighbors began to notice her working in the garden day after day. Some offered words of encouragement, others brought seedlings to plant. The garden transformed slowly, becoming a patchwork of vibrant colors. It became a sanctuary for Claire, and soon for the community as well. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, Claire held a small memorial in the garden, inviting neighbors, friends, and even local organizations to raise awareness about online scams. At the event, Claire stood in front of the blooming garden. Her voice wavered as she began to speak. "This garden was my mother's favorite place. It was where she found joy, even in the hardest times. But she was taken from us by someone who preyed on her kindness, her vulnerability." Her voice broke, but she continued. "I can't bring her back, I can't change what happened, but I can make sure her story is told, so others don't have to feel this pain." The crowd nodded in solemn agreement. Margaret's story had become more than a cautionary tale. It was a call to action. Later that evening, Claire sat alone in the garden, the last rays of sunlight casting a warm glow over the flowers. She held the letter Margaret had sent her, now creased from being read so many times. "I miss you, Mom," she whispered. "I hope you know I'm trying." The breeze rustled the flowers gently, as though carrying her words to someone far away. Claire placed the fragile bloom Margaret had left behind into the soil and carefully patted it down. It was the last piece of her mother, now planted in the place Margaret had loved most. The camera pans out, showing the full garden in its restored beauty. Claire wipes away a tear as she stands, looking at the sky. The screen fades to black, with Margaret's words lingering in the air. "Take care of the garden."